the time Nazi prisoners of war started a full-blown riot right here in Canada. Not in Germany, not in some war-torn European city, in Canada, the land of maple syrup and apologies. And this wasn't just some minor scuffle or a few angry words exchanged through a fence. This was blood, chaos, and violence that left people dead on Canadian soil during World War II. And here's the thing that'll really get you. Most Canadians have no idea this ever happened. We're going back to 1943. The war is raging across Europe and the Pacific. Young men from all over the world are dying by the thousands every single day. But here in Canada, thousands of miles from the front lines, something completely unexpected is brewing behind barbed wire in a place called Bowmanville, Ontario. It's a prisoner of war camp, and inside those fences are some of the most dangerous, most devoted, most fanatical soldiers the German military had to offer. U-boat commanders who sent Allied ships to the bottom of the Atlantic, Luftwaffe pilots who bombed British cities, hardened veterans who believed with every fiber of their being that Germany would win this war and that Hitler was leading them to glory. These weren't defeated men. These were prisoners who still thought they were winning. The Canadian government thought they had everything under control. After all, Canada was taking in POWs from all over because Britain was getting overwhelmed. There were camps scattered across the country, from Ontario to Alberta. Most of them ran smoothly. The prisoners were treated according to the Geneva Convention. They got food, shelter, medical care. They weren't tortured or abused. By all accounts, Canada was playing by the rules, but Bowmanville was different. Bowmanville held the troublemakers, the officers, the true believers, the men who refused to accept that they'd been captured and who spent every waking moment thinking about escape, resistance, and making life difficult for their captors. Now, before we get into the actual riot, you need to understand something about how these POW camps worked. This wasn't like a prison you see in movies today. These were military officers being held by other military officers. There was a strange code of respect that existed, even between enemies. The Canadian guards weren't cruel. They didn't beat prisoners. They followed the rules strictly. And the German prisoners, for their part, were organized, disciplined, and ran their own internal hierarchy inside the camp. The senior German officers had authority over their own men. They held formations. They maintained military protocol. They even celebrated German military holidays. It was like a little piece of the German military transplanted onto Canadian soil. But tensions were always simmering just below the surface. The German prisoners knew what was happening back home. They got news through secret radios they'd built from smuggled parts. They knew about the Allied bombing campaigns destroying German cities. They knew their families might be dead or suffering. And they knew that the tide of the war was starting to turn against Germany, even if they wouldn't admit it out loud. Every day they spent behind that wire was another day of humiliation, another day of powerlessness, another day further from the glory they'd once imagined for themselves. Then came the order that changed everything. It was October 1942, and British authorities had discovered that German forces were shackling Canadian and British prisoners during interrogations and transfers. This was a violation of the Geneva Convention, a deliberate attempt to humiliate and control Allied POWs. So the British government decided to respond in kind. If Germany was going to shackle Allied prisoners, then the Allies would shackle German prisoners. An eye for an eye. Seems fair, right? Well, the problem was that the German officers in Canadian camps like Bowmanville saw this as a direct insult to their honor. These were men who still wore their uniforms with pride, who saluted the German flag every morning, who considered themselves representatives of the German military. And now they were being told they'd be chained up like common criminals. The order came down through official channels. The Canadian authorities at Bowmanville were instructed to shackle certain high-ranking German prisoners. The camp commander, a Canadian officer who'd been running things relatively smoothly up until this point, knew this wasn't going to go well. He'd been dealing with these men for months. He knew their pride, their stubbornness, their absolute refusal to be humiliated. But orders were orders. So on October 10th, 1942, the guards entered the compound to carry out the shackling order. The Germans refused, not just a polite "we'd rather not." They absolutely, completely, categorically refused. The senior German officers gathered their men and made it clear, no one would submit to being shackled, not today, not ever. They saw this as a test of their resolve, a chance to prove that even in captivity, they were still soldiers, still warriors, still men of honor. The Canadian Guards backed off that first day. Nobody wanted to start a fight over some chains. Maybe cooler heads would prevail. Maybe the Germans would come around once they'd thought about it. Maybe this could be resolved peacefully. It could not be resolved peacefully. The next day the Canadians came back with reinforcements, more guards, clear instructions. The prisoners would be shackled whether they liked it or not. What happened next was absolute chaos. The Germans had spent the night preparing. They'd organized themselves into units. They'd gathered whatever they could use as weapons, clubs made from bed slats, makeshift shields, anything that could help them resist. When the Canadian Guards entered the compound, they walked into an ambush. The Germans attacked with shocking ferocity. These weren't desperate, panicked men. These were trained soldiers executing a coordinated defense. They'd barricaded themselves inside the buildings. They'd assigned men to different positions. They'd even designated medics to treat the wounded. This wasn't a riot. This was a military operation. The Canadian Guards were overwhelmed almost immediately. Fists flew. Clubs cracked against skulls. Men went down on both sides. The Guards retreated, regrouped, and called for backup. What followed was 3 days of running battles inside the compound. 3 days. Think about that for a moment. For 3 full days, German prisoners of war fought Canadian Guards on Canadian soil while the world was at war elsewhere. The camp became a battlefield. The Germans fortified the main buildings and refused to come out. The Canadians tried various tactics to force them out. They turned off the heat in the middle of October. They cut off food supplies. They threatened, they negotiated, they pleaded. Nothing worked. The Germans weren't budging. On the second day, the Canadians brought in reinforcements from nearby military bases. Soldiers with rifles formed lines around the buildings. Officers tried to negotiate with the German leaders inside. They explained that this was about international protocol, about reciprocity, about protecting Allied prisoners in German camps. The German officers didn't care. They saw this as a matter of principle. They'd rather die fighting than be humiliated. And people did get hurt, seriously hurt. Guards suffered broken bones, concussions, deep cuts from improvised weapons. German prisoners were beaten with batons and rifle butts. Blood stained the floors of the barracks. Men on both sides ended up in the camp hospital. And through it all, the Germans maintained their discipline. They sang military songs. They held formations in between clashes. They treated this like a last stand, like they were defending some crucial strategic position, instead of just refusing to wear chains. By the third day, the Canadians had had enough. They brought in fire hoses. The plan was simple: blast the Germans with high-pressure water until they either gave up or got flushed out of the buildings. And that's exactly what they did. The hoses smashed through windows and doors. Freezing water flooded the barracks. The Germans tried to hold their positions, but you can't fight physics. You can't stay in a building that's rapidly filling with water. Slowly, reluctantly, in small groups, the prisoners began to emerge. Soaking wet, exhausted, defeated, but still defiant. The Canadians finally managed to shackle the prisoners. It took overwhelming force. It took 3 days of fighting. It took injuries on both sides, but they did it. The Germans wore their chains. The order had been carried out, and for a brief moment it seemed like the crisis was over. But here's where the story takes another turn. The shackling policy didn't last. Within weeks, international pressure and negotiations between Germany and the Allies led to both sides agreeing to stop the practice. The chains came off. The whole thing, all that fighting, all those injuries, all that chaos, it was for a policy that barely lasted 2 months. You might think the Germans would have felt vindicated. You might think they'd have celebrated this as a victory. But that's not what happened. Instead, the riot at Bowmanville became a turning point in how Canada handled POW camps. The authorities realized they'd almost lost control. They realized that these prisoners, even behind barbed wire, even thousands of miles from home, were still dangerous, still organized, still capable of violence. Security was tightened across all Canadian POW camps. More guards were assigned. Policies were revised. The relatively relaxed atmosphere that had existed before was replaced with stricter controls and constant vigilance. And the Germans, they went back to their routines. They kept trying to escape. They kept building secret radios. They kept maintaining their military structure and their belief in eventual German victory. But something had changed. The riot had shown both sides what could happen when pride and principle collided with reality. The Canadian Guards never forgot how quickly things could spiral out of control. And the German prisoners, for all their defiance, had learned that even their impressive discipline and organization couldn't overcome the simple fact that they were prisoners in a foreign land, far from home, while their country was losing a war. But here's what really gets me about this story. After the war ended, after Germany surrendered, after these prisoners went home, very few of them ever talked about the Bowmanville riot. It was almost like it embarrassed them. They'd fought so hard, sacrificed so much, maintained such rigid discipline, all in service of a cause that ultimately failed. The Nazi regime they'd believed in collapsed. The Germany they'd fought for lay in ruins. And looking back on the riot, it must have seemed futile. What had they accomplished? They'd delayed being shackled by a few days. They'd proven their loyalty to a government that lost the war and committed unthinkable atrocities. They'd risked their lives for a policy that was reversed almost immediately. The Canadian Guards didn't talk much about it either. There was no glory in fighting unarmed prisoners, even if those prisoners were attacking them. There was no honor in hosing down men with fire hoses to force them into submission. It was ugly, brutal, necessary work, but not something anyone wanted to remember or celebrate. So the whole incident got quietly filed away in government archives, a footnote in the larger story of World War II. A strange, violent chapter that didn't fit neatly into anyone's narrative of the war. Today, if you go to Bowmanville, there's barely any trace of what happened there. The POW camp is long gone. The land has been redeveloped. The buildings where German soldiers fought Canadian Guards no longer exist. There's a small historical marker, easy to miss if you're not looking for it. Local historians know the story, but it's not taught in schools. It's not in the textbooks. It's not part of the popular understanding of Canada's role in World War II. We remember the battles our soldiers fought overseas. We remember the sacrifices made on European soil. But this bizarre, violent episode that happened right here at home, it's been almost completely forgotten. And maybe that's intentional. Maybe nobody really wants to remember a time when Nazi prisoners rioted on Canadian soil. Maybe it complicates the clean narrative of Canada as a peacekeeping nation that always does the right thing. Maybe it raises uncomfortable questions about how we treated prisoners, about the effectiveness of international conventions during wartime, about the strange psychology of men who kept fighting even after they'd been captured. These aren't easy questions, and they don't have simple answers. But I think there's value in remembering this story, not because it's uplifting or because it makes anyone look particularly good, but because it's real. It happened. Real men fought and bled and suffered, both prisoners and guards, over a policy that seemed important at the time but looks almost absurd in hindsight. It's a reminder that war isn't just the big battles and the famous generals and the turning points everyone knows about. War is also the small, strange, forgotten moments. The riots in prison camps, the policies that backfire, the decisions that seem necessary in the moment but turn out to be mistakes. The men who fought in that riot on both sides, they're almost all gone now. The last veterans of World War II are passing away. Soon there won't be anyone left who remembers these events firsthand. The stories will exist only in documents and archives and recordings. And stories like the Bowmanville riot, the ones that never made it into the mainstream history books, they'll fade even faster, unless we make an effort to remember them, unless we tell these stories to new generations, unless we acknowledge that history is messy and complicated, and full of moments that don't fit neatly into hero narratives. You know what strikes me most about this whole story? It's the sheer stubbornness on both sides. The Germans who'd rather fight than accept what they saw as humiliation. The Canadians who kept coming back day after day to enforce an order they probably knew was causing more trouble than it was worth. Nobody would back down. Nobody would compromise. And that stubbornness, that absolute refusal to give an inch, that's what turned what could have been a minor confrontation into a 3-day battle that left people injured and traumatized. It makes you think about all the other times in history when stubbornness and pride have led to violence and suffering. All the wars that could have been avoided if someone had been willing to compromise. All the conflicts that escalated because nobody wanted to be the first one to back down. The Bowmanville riot is like a microcosm of that larger problem. A small-scale example of how quickly things can spiral out of control when people are more concerned with honor and principle than with practical solutions. And here's something else that's interesting. After the riot, after the chains came off, the Germans and Canadians at Bowmanville had to go back to living in close proximity. The prisoners still needed to be guarded. The guards still needed to do their jobs. And somehow they managed to move past what had happened. There were no revenge attacks, no ongoing feuds. They went back to the strange, tense, but mostly peaceful coexistence that had existed before the riot. It wasn't friendship. It wasn't trust, but it was functional. Both sides recognized that they had to get through the rest of the war somehow, and that meant putting the violence behind them. That takes a certain kind of maturity, doesn't it? The ability to fight someone fiercely and then shake it off and move forward. Maybe that's one of the most overlooked aspects of military culture. Soldiers are trained to fight, yes, but they're also trained to follow orders, to maintain discipline, to separate the personal from the professional. The Germans who fought the Canadian Guards weren't holding personal grudges. They were following the orders of their own officers, defending what they saw as German military honor. And the Canadian Guards who fought back weren't acting out of hatred for Germans. They were enforcing the orders they'd been given, maintaining security, doing their jobs. Once the immediate crisis passed, both sides could step back and recognize that they'd just been playing their assigned roles in a much larger conflict. So what's the lesson here? What are we supposed to take away from this forgotten riot in a Canadian POW camp? Maybe it's that history is full of stories that don't fit our expectations. Canada, the peaceful nation, the country that prides itself on diplomacy and tolerance, was also the site of violent clashes between guards and Nazi prisoners. The Germans, often portrayed in popular culture as either evil villains or defeated victims, were in this case organized, disciplined soldiers who fought for principles they believed in, even if those principles were ultimately in service of a monstrous regime. The story isn't black and white. It's complicated and messy and full of contradictions. Maybe the lesson is that even small decisions can have huge consequences. The decision to implement the shackling policy seemed reasonable to British and Canadian authorities. It was meant to protect Allied prisoners in German camps, but nobody anticipated that it would lead to a 3-day riot. Nobody thought about how proud, trained German officers would react to being treated like criminals. The policymakers were thinking in terms of international diplomacy and reciprocal treatment. The prisoners on the ground were thinking in terms of personal honor and military dignity. Those two perspectives never aligned, and violence was the result. Or maybe the lesson is simply that we need to remember these stories, even the uncomfortable ones, even the ones that don't make anyone look good. Because forgetting history doesn't make it go away. It just means we're more likely to repeat the same mistakes. The Bowmanville riot happened because of stubbornness, pride, and a failure to consider how policies would be received by the people they affected. Those are lessons that apply to any era, any conflict, any situation where human beings are trying to coexist under difficult circumstances. The riot at Bowmanville lasted 3 days in October 1942, but its echoes lasted much longer. The injured men carried scars, both physical and mental. The policies governing Canadian POW camps were permanently altered. The relationship between guards and prisoners across all Canadian camps became more cautious, more formal, less trusting. And somewhere in Germany, when news of the riot eventually filtered back, families of the prisoners must have wondered what their fathers and brothers and sons were going through in this distant Canadian camp. And thinking about those families brings up another angle to this story. These German prisoners, they had wives and children back home. They had mothers who worried about them. They had communities waiting for them to return. When they rioted, when they fought Canadian guards, when they risked injury or worse over the issue of being shackled, were they thinking about those families? Did they consider that their actions might lead to harsher treatment? Or were they so focused on military honor and duty that personal considerations didn't matter? We'll never know for sure because so few of them ever spoke about it afterwards, but it's worth considering. The same goes for the Canadian Guards. These were men who'd signed up to serve their country, who'd expected to be sent overseas to fight Germans on European battlefields. Instead, they ended up fighting Germans in their own backyard, in a small Ontario town, in a situation that must have felt surreal and confusing. They had families, too. They had wives who worried every time violence broke out in the camp. They had children who maybe didn't fully understand why Daddy had to go guard dangerous prisoners instead of going off to fight in the real war. The guards at Bowmanville were doing an important job, keeping enemy combatants secure, but it wasn't the kind of job that came with glory or recognition. There's a particular kind of tragedy in conflicts like this. Nobody wins. The Germans didn't avoid being shackled, they just delayed it and got hurt in the process. The Canadians enforced the order, but at significant cost and effort for a policy that was going to be reversed anyway. Both sides suffered. Both sides probably wished the whole thing had never happened. And yet, in that moment, in those 3 days in October 1942, the riot felt necessary, felt inevitable, felt like the only possible response to the situation at hand. That's the tragedy of it. Not that it happened, but that everyone involved felt like it had to happen. War does that to people. It puts them in impossible situations where there are no good choices, only less bad ones. The German prisoners could have submitted peacefully to being shackled, but that would have meant betraying their sense of honor and duty. They could have fought, which they did, but that meant risking injury for a cause that ultimately failed. The Canadian authorities could have refused to implement the shackling policy, but that would have meant disobeying orders from British command. They could have implemented it, which they did, but that meant provoking a violent confrontation that could have been avoided. Every choice led somewhere bad. That's the nature of war. So here we are, more than 80 years after the Bowmanville riot, talking about something most people have never heard of. 3 days of violence in a prisoner of war camp in Ontario. It didn't change the outcome of World War II. It didn't affect the grand strategy of the Allied forces. It didn't make headlines around the world. It was just one small incident in a war that was full of much larger, much more significant events. And yet, for the men who were there, for the prisoners who fought and the guards who fought back, those 3 days were everything. They were the moment when all the tension and frustration and anger that had been building finally exploded. They were the moment when the careful balance of the POW camp system broke down. They were the moment when everyone involved had to confront just how fragile peace really is, even between people who are supposed to be bound by international law and military honor. The Bowmanville riot is a reminder that history isn't just made by presidents and generals and famous battles. It's also made by ordinary people in extraordinary circumstances, making difficult choices with imperfect information, trying to do what they think is right even when there's no clear right answer. The German prisoners who rioted weren't evil monsters. They were soldiers who believed in their cause and who couldn't stomach what they saw as humiliation. The Canadian guards who fought them weren't brutal oppressors. They were men following orders, trying to maintain security, doing a difficult job in difficult times. Everyone was just trying to get through the war, trying to survive, trying to maintain some sense of dignity and purpose in a world gone mad. That's the real story of the Bowmanville riot. Not the violence itself, though that's dramatic and shocking. Not the details of who did what to whom, though those details are fascinating. The real story is about human nature, about pride and stubbornness, about the codes of honor that soldiers live by, about the impossible situations war creates, about the small, forgotten moments that reveal as much about history as the famous battles everyone remembers. The Bowmanville riot shows us that even in the middle of the biggest war in human history, with millions dying on battlefields around the world, a few hundred men in a small Canadian town could create their own war, their own crisis, their own moment of chaos and violence, all over a policy about chains that would be reversed within weeks. If that doesn't tell you something profound about human nature and the absurdity of war, I don't know what does.